the way that you want it to happen. And I wonder whether we shouldn't place this new idea of going back to the First World War as being, in effect pointless, as a reflection of our current disillusionment with the use of military force. But I think we should try to see the First World War as contemporaries viewed it, and viewed it at the time for that matter, and try to avoid the excessive use of hindsight, and in particular the imposition of 21st century values on individuals who lived 100 years ago. Well, Holger Herwig, a Canadian historian, has pointed out that the line taken by Sleepwalkers and various other books leads, what he said, dangerously back to Lloyd George's idea of the Great War came about because the power somehow stumbled into conflict. And to take the stumbling view is really to ignore 50 years of research. And I think that Holger Herwig is right. The evidence is compelling that far from the nations of Europe somehow sleepwalking into war, that there is nobody there in the end to blame, Germany and Austria-Hungary bear the primary responsibility for beginning the war. And that's going to be the thrust of my talk this evening. The rise of German power is, of course, fundamental to understand why war broke out in 1914. And for this we must go back to at least 1871, when as a consequence of a comprehensive defeat, Napoleon III's France, which up to that point had been the dominant military power on the continent, the German states, except Austria, were united into one state under Prussian leadership. Now, such a seismic shift in the balance of power often results in war or conflict, or at very least international stability. 1871, however, was an exception. And I think the individual we can thank for this rather strange state of affairs is this one, Otto von Bismarck, the Iron Chancellor. To put it mildly, he's not one of history's more cuddly characters. He's actually a ruthless exponent of the Clausewitzian notion of using war as an instrument of policy, but actually having achieved the result he was aiming for, the unification of Germany under Prussian leadership, and in the process having shattered the European balance of power, he then rebuilt that balance of power and located Germany very firmly within it. Germany under Bismarck became a status quo power. It was put to me in a rather sort of acrimonious spat earlier this year about the origins of the war. Why is it that Britain felt it necessary to go to war in 1914 when it hadn't seen necessary to go to war in 1870-71 when Germany defeated France? Well, there are numerous answers to that, but I guess the simple one is that Britain did not perceive the Prussia, then the newly reunited Germany, as being a threat, because Bismarck was very careful to diffuse such views, particularly by, of course, by staying out of Belgium. More about Belgium later on. Well, so far we've actually got a situation in which, one balance of power had been shattered, a new one's been created, but unfortunately it was heavily dependent on Bismarck himself. The accession to the German throne of the other gentleman on the screen, I use the phrase loosely, Kaiser Wilhelm II, changed all that. He came to the throne in 1888 and within 2 years had dismissed Bismarck and taken on personal rule of Germany. Wilhelm is a fascinating character. He was, of course, half English. His mother was a daughter of Queen Victoria, and he had a love-hate relationship with his mother's homeland. He had been damaged at birth. Of course, most famously, he had a withered arm. It's strongly suspect, actually, there was some sort of mental damage happening at the same stage. Certainly, he proved to be the loosest of loose cannons on the world stage. On meeting him in 1891, the then British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, wondered whether the Kaiser was all there. A question we may well ask ourselves. He loved dressing up in fancy uniforms and had a mercurial personality. He wanted to rule as well as to reign. And it's often been said that had Bismarck been kept alive on some sort of life support machine in 1914, war simply wouldn't have happened if Bismarck was still running Germany. That may well be true, but it also says something rather worrying about the status of a great power, that it's so much is dependent on one individual maintaining the reins of power. Well, once that Wilhelm had got rid of Bismarck, he rapidly proved that he was simply not up to the job of running a state, or at least heading up its foreign policy in the situation of the 1890s. His maladroit interventions on the world stage proved to be completely disastrous. Weltpolitik, world policy, a drive to gain colonies and expand German power and economic influence, was one thing, but in the process, Bismarck's carefully constructed series of alliances were sacrificed. In particular, Germany and Russia found themselves in pretty short order on opposite sides. The Russians and the French formed an alliance between 1892 and 1894. Well, given that you had the most autocratic state in Europe in the form of Russia and a republican state in the form of France, looks like a pretty unnatural alliance. It's actually, of course, created fundamentally by fear of Germany, their mutual potential enemy. Well, okay, that takes us so far. But what about Britain and the Empire? Up to about 1900, the average Brit, and I dare say the average Australian, regarded Germany as being at least a potentially friendly power. Britain's historic enemy, of course, was France. Its other enemy, or its potential enemy, was Russia because of its colonial rivalry, particularly over Central Asia. And yet, within 10 years, that had been flipped on its head. First of all, in 1904, then in 1907, Britain had come to arrangements with both France and Russia, and Germany had become the potential enemy. The enemy, certainly, which British generals saw as being the most likely enemy for a major war. Germany basically throwing its weight around had a lot to do with this. The fact that the Kaiser was very bellicose in supporting the South African Boer republics in the Boer War. But the major reason, of course, is the beginning of a very significant expansion of the German Navy. In 1898, the first of the German naval laws are passed, and this aimed to create a navy which could actually have no other target than Britain. Britain being an island that was reliant on sea power for its first line of defence, this had the impact of driving Britain into the arms of France and Russia. So to look at the revolution, the diplomatic revolution in the decade or so prior to the First World War, I think we need to look at the really maladroit diplomacy of Germany, and in particular the absolute gratuitous making of an enemy in the form of Great Britain. Britain, of course, prior to 1900 thereabouts, had pursued a policy of splendid isolation, that is, staying clear of foreign entanglements. That was all well and good as long as two factors were in play. The first one was absolute naval security, which Britain basically had at that point. There had been various scares. For example, the French Navy had been seen as a major threat at one point, but by the end of the 19th century, Britain was feeling pretty secure. The other thing, of course, is that British foreign policy, before that English foreign policy, going back to at least the 16th century in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, had been to basically block any attempt by a major continental state to develop hegemony over Europe. So, the England of Elizabeth fought against